I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a fresh look at Lordran as my community ranks the areas of Dark Souls based on their difficulty. I've done an area ranking in the past which was based on area quality, and which I just enjoy, but here we're focusing on the difficulty angle because it introduces a very different metric. I asked my audience to give each area a rating from 1 to 10, with 1 being the easiest option and 10 being the hardest option. I then tallied the votes, figured out the average, and that's what's being used to set up this ranking. Now, I do have to admit something very embarrassing, something I did not catch until halfway through scripting this video. I may have forgotten to include the Great Hollow and Ash Lake within the poll, and I can't rerun the poll and ask my voters to re-vote because it's just not fair to them the time they put in, and there's a chance they won't even see the re-poll. So instead, my solution is pretty simple. I will still be talking about both of these areas, I'll just include them where I feel they would have landed had they been in the difficulty poll. So you'll still get to hear about the Great Hollow and Ash Lake, there are just no voter comments attached to it. Massive thank you to the voters though for tuning in and supporting the poll, and if you want to participate in a future community ranking, the Demon Souls area difficulty poll is already up. You can find it at the top of the description, and it does have every area from that game. So be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of my future videos, and let's jump right in. The Dark Souls areas ranked by difficulty. Let me know if you agree with my community down below. At number 25, we have the Northern Undead Asylum, which scored a total average of 1.64 out of 10. Specifically, this entry focuses on the tutorial, which is the first level in the game. You awaken in a dark cell, you pick up a key, and then you follow a linear underground path leading to a ladder that takes you to your first bonfire. From here, the only truly difficult portion of the level hits, as you're immediately thrust into a boss fight against the Asylum Demon. You have to figure out that you're not intended to fight him yet, and instead need to find a doorway that leads out of the arena to another bonfire. Then you collect a working shield and a weapon, which will allow you to fight the enemies of the Asylum and ultimately come out on top. Some other standout moments include the rolling ball trap on the east side of the second floor, which also acts as a way to break the wall down so you can access Oscar and collect your Estus flask. I also like the area leading up to the boss fog, as you've got a few decent enemies to fight, and you can enter this side room to take on a slightly tougher Hollow variant for practice. The challenge though is always going to be the Asylum Demon boss fight, as you have to defeat him in order to get the key that unlocks the main door, but with a plunging attack and some booty hugging, you're not in trouble. This tutorial felt hard back in the day when nobody knew how to play Soulsborne games, and I firmly believe new players who have never dabbled in the genre will still find the Northern Undead Asylum a tad difficult. But for my community, who is likely made up of Souls veterans, we've come a long way since then. At number 24, we have Firelink Shrine, which scored a total average of 2.65 out of 10. On the form, I specified that my criteria for Firelink was that it includes the cliff path leading up to the aqueduct which takes you to the Undead Burg, as well as the above-ground cemetery where the skeletons roam and you can find some wonderful weapons. Because that cemetery is infamous for absolutely destroying new players who wander in that direction when they first land at Firelink Shrine. Because of this, I assumed Firelink might get a slightly higher difficulty ranking than it did, but being this low down makes sense when you consider this is just a massive hub area. There are no real dangers in the main part of the shrine, except for those you create yourself. If you attack an NPC, you might have to deal with a tough fight, or maybe you want to do some tricky parkour so you can go back to the asylum or find some extra loot. You don't have to run through the graveyard to collect those items at the very start of the game if you don't want to, nor do you have to make the nervous jump for the Ring of Sacrifice beneath the aqueduct on your way to the Burg. You're only required to fight the enemies on the cliffside. So from that perspective, Firelink Shrine is a very chill place to be. one of my favourite areas in the game, and a fantastic hub with so many connections, but not really relevant in a difficulty ranking. At number 23, we have the Northern Undead Asylum Revisit, which scored a total average of 3.48 out of 10. If you do some tricky parkour from the Undead Parish elevator, you can make your way to the nest of a giant crow, curl up within, and it will eventually appear to bring you back to the asylum. There are 3 reasons you would want to come back. The first is a boss fight against the Stray Demon, which involves falling through the floor of the main room, which is such a rude surprise, especially if you're dead set on going to the bonfire in the far courtyard, as you might accidentally trigger the fight, die, and reappear back at Firelink since you didn't reach a bonfire in the asylum. It's a tough refight, there's some AoE trickery that makes things a little more difficult, it's just an interesting time. The second reason to return here is so you can use a key found on a rooftop in Firelink to open a gate that leads to the Rusted Iron Ring. Equipping this ring allows you to run through the Blighttown Swamp like it's normal terrain, and that is a beautiful thing. The third reason to return is the peculiar doll found in your starting cell, which is required in order to reach the painted world of Ariamis. The challenge of this revisit is that the enemies will hit a bit harder, and 2 Black Knights have been stationed in the asylum, one by your cell, guarding the peculiar doll, and the other in the hall where you got your first shield. These guys can and will fuck you up if you fight them in the early game. Luckily, they're the regular sword variant, which means you can parry them if you learn the timings, which I'm kinda good at. So overall, yeah, the asylum doesn't end up being terribly hard on a revisit, especially as you get to control when you return. You can come back immediately, or you can wait a long time and return in the late game to just decimate everything with a fully upgraded weapon. At number 22, we have the Undead Burg, which scored a total average of 3.62 out of 10. It's definitely a good sign that the first proper explorable area of Lordran itself is considered one of the easiest. Game Design 101, make the easy area easy. This entry encompasses the Burg all the way to the Hellkite Bridge, with the lower Undead Burg you unlock via a key being its own entry later in this video. I've always felt they're separate enough in difficulty and enemy variety. The Undead Burg is a fairly linear area if you like to push forwards when exploring, but has a ton of very small side paths that have basic items that will help you in your early game, as well as a vendor who can sell some useful key items and, if killed, will drop the Ujigatana. I personally always struggled with the shielded spear hollows because I used to suck at their parry timings, and they really like to turtle behind their shields. Other notable moments include the Firebomb Bridge, where if you pause for a moment, you'll be blasted into oblivion. There's a hidden Black Knight towards the end of the level, who acts as a solid extra challenge for people who want to test their mettle, and killing him does unlock a tricky but satisfying shortcut from the Firebomb Bridge. The bonfire being at the center of the zone means that once you commit to the Undead Burg, you're locked in until you can beat the area, and while it may seem like there are a lot of enemies, you learn how to fight them pretty quickly, and it's the best way to teach players the basics of combat. Taurus Demon is a bit rough with the thin arena and his not so lenient hitboxes, as is the Hellkite Bridge if you try and go for the bonfire next to the Sunlight Altar, but that last part is entirely optional, and thus not as important towards the difficulty discussion. We did get one voter comment on the Undead Burg, so let's hear it. I will quickly say that on my first playthrough, I died hundreds of times during the first run through the Undead Burg, so much so that I'll probably remember it still when I'm drowning in about 50 years thanks to climate change. Nowadays, the Burg is a joke, but a very respectable one thanks to its moderate challenges of hollows, rolling flaming barrels, and the Black Knight that are pretty tough on a first playthrough. Unless you know about the Drake Sword, but who'd do that? I'm too much of a Kendrick fan to resort to that. Great area. And it's clear that the Undead Burg is a small fan favourite, with it being the voters' overall third favourite area in the game. It's fair to say that I think my community can respect a good zone when it exists. Gives me a lot of faith for future videos in this series. At number 21, we have Darkroot Garden, which scored a total average of 4.02 out of 10. My favourite area in Dark Souls, with such a gorgeous aesthetic and 2 entire zones to explore, the Moonlight Butterfly Grove and the massive forest leading to Sif. I'm not surprised to see Darkroot considered an easy area, because it's very open, gives players a lot of space, and a majority of the enemies you encounter can be outrun without any issue. The only creatures that pose a threat are the Stone Guardians, who can impact you with a slowness debuff, but even then, if you know where they spawn, you can just avoid them entirely. Running to the butterfly isn't an issue, especially when you get a centralized bonfire behind an illusory wall that leaves you at the entrance to both parts of the garden. And if you join the Covenant ran by Alvina, you won't even get attacked by the NPC enemies in the first half of Upper Darkroot Forest. The main dangers you'll face are the mushroom people, who don't often hit, but when they do, land a punch like it's Mike Tyson, and the giant cats near the shortcut ladder that leads down to Darkroot Basin. Those gatas have terrorized me and other players for years, and I feel they are a massive step up in terms of danger compared to the rest of the garden. Both bosses here are pretty standard. Moonlight Butterfly is just dodging spells until it lands, while Sif is about staying beneath the doggo so you don't get hit by the sword, which does generally big damage. That's one small prop for Sif. You're likely not going to die much in Darkroot Garden, with the more dangerous part of the zone being its little brother, the basin below, which we'll get to in a couple entries. At number 20, we have the Kiln of the First Flame, which scored a total average of 4.31 out of 10. Admittedly, looking at the Kiln, I'd probably rank it a couple spots lower, my main reasoning being that the only danger here are the Black Knights, all of which are incredibly easy to run past, and with them being the sole enemies you have to face, you can pretty easily learn their movesets. It's a lot of strafing and spatial awareness, especially when you fight the one knight on the very thin walkways leading to the spiral staircase, and I think that might be the reason why the Kiln isn't in the bottom 5. That and Gwyn, if you don't know how to parry him. Maybe my voters can shed some light for me? The Kiln might be the easiest part of the game, aside from the tutorial. By this point, the knights are nothing before us, and the ambient sadness of the world is heavy. It's a victory lap in a way, but one that does not offer joy or comfort. Gwyn sacrificed himself, and the world is still slowly crumbling. Even as you carve, bash, blast your way past the foes, you realize that in the end, you're not facing a god in their prime, you're on your way to put them out of their misery. Okay, this voter is more on my side when it comes to Kiln opinions. I do feel like if you're at the Kiln, you should know how to handle a Black Knight enemy type, and with the Kiln's length being so short, I could justify ranking it below Darkroot and the Undead Burg. I said it! Kiln of the First Flame could nearly be the easiest area, because by that stage of the game, the player has significant experience against Black Knights, while some of the early game areas rank higher than expected on difficulty solely based on a first time run when getting used to game mechanics. It makes even basic enemies a risk. Could probably lower every area before Sen's Fortress by 1 or 2 points on a second playthrough and beyond. A valid opinion, Kiln is always going to be easy for its place in the game because it comes at the end of a playthrough filled with experience, but those early areas? Do you rank them based on your first playthroughs? Do you rank them based on your current skill level? That's something for each voter to figure out for themselves. At number 19, we have Darkroot Basin, which scored a total average of 4.37 out of 10. This is a connective area that bridges the gap between Darkroot Garden, the Undead Burg, the DLC, and the Valley of the Drakes. All in all, it's not a particularly large zone, nor is it really required if you're doing the main story. For me, the most valuable part of this area is the Black Knight guarding a nearby bonfire, and the Grass Crest Shield. Fighting any enemies on these narrow sloping cliff paths is always nerve-wracking for me. But the main difficulty of this area comes from the basin itself. Getting through a small forest of crystal golems, you're faced with a giant hydra, one of only 2 in the game, the other found in Ash Lake, and I would argue this is the harder hydra. It's tougher to see where the drop-off point is for terrain beneath the water. On top of that, you're facing this hydra much earlier in the game, so it can likely 2 or even 1-shot you if you're not careful, and then if you want to leave, you run into decided to havel the rock right on the border of the undead berg, and he will squish you like a bug. The only reason I give Darkroot Basin anything above a 5 is because of that damned Hydra. I swear, I can be all the way over in Dark Souls 3 and it will still find a way to hit me for half my health bar. Once you finally get over there, you have to walk like an elderly man trying to cross the street to make sure you don't fall in the chasm below, and the jank of the Hydra's hitboxes really doesn't help either. But hey, at least it's for a pretty damn good DLC. Still funny that you have to do the exact opposite thing that you should be doing when fighting a Hydra to kill it. You know what, I've never thought about it, but this user is right. In Greek mythology, cutting off a Hydra's head one at a time would only result in more heads sprouting soon after. Miyazaki, where is my mythologically accurate Hydra? At number 18, we have the Valley of the Drakes, which scored a total average of 4.41 out of 10. Yet another connective area. This is a thin chasm that separates Darkroot Basin, New Londo Ruins, and Blighttown. Most players will visit this area on their way out of Blighttown, picking up a key and immediately using it to open a door to New Londo, before never coming back here again. For those that do explore the valley though, there's a bridge with a host of lesser drakes that you can cross when you lower New Londo's water level, which acts as a wonderfully quick shortcut to the inner city. Or you can run along the tight chasm walls until you come across an undead dragon. This is the main feature of the valley, as if you defeat it, you get some good loot, and you pretty much negate the danger of this area. This is also just a good farming zone in general for specific upgrade materials that the drakes drop. But difficulty, it really just comes down to how much you can handle some of the electric AoEs from the lesser drakes. Valley of the Drakes is just why? Wherefore? How come? For what reason? Why again? It's just a straight walk connecting 4 different areas with a grand total of 6 enemies in it. Lordran really needs some Kendricks around because the drakes themselves are terrible as well. This very game literally has multiple better areas that are just straight walks with 6 enemies. Okay, that is the second Kendrick versus Drake joke I've read in this poll, and I'm just gonna be honest, as somebody who does not listen to that type of music, I am so lost. I'm just a British. I don't follow this beef, it ain't my cup of tea. Valley of the Drakes is a connective area. That is the why, dear voter. But I do agree that it needs more. At least the enemies are tougher than average when they're not throwing themselves into the void. At number 17, we have the Undead Parish, which scored a total average of 4.46 out of 10. I definitely see the parish as a big step up in difficulty, while still retaining that early game feel. For example, you are immediately met by an Iron Boar mini-boss, which has the potential to destroy you with a single charge if you're not prepared. There are a ton of archers and ranged hollows that you need to keep track of, and as you progress through the parish, you kinda realize how dangerous basic hollows can be. That basement room filled with enemies ambushing you, the channeler before the gargoyles rallying an entire room of hollows to two-shot you with their dinky weapons, the slightly tougher movesets of the Boulder Knights that you have to adapt to, the giant knight that guards the Firekeeper soul, and so many cramped corridors that make fighting with a large weapon a real pain. You're good with a short sword or daggers, but bring a Zweihander into the parish and you're going to be bonking off those walls constantly. I'd argue I have more trouble getting through the parish than I do getting through something like the depths, which I'm sure sounds insane to some of you, but at least with the depths you have multiple shortcuts that cut your time down. I suck at getting through that closing gate in the parish, which leaves me with a constant having to run through all the different corridors and halls. At least you all like the place though, with it getting a couple votes for favourite area and nobody listing it as their least favourite. Fantastic. At number 16, we have the Lower Undead Berg, which scored a total average of 4.89 out of 10. And I'm actually surprised it received no votes for least favourite area, because I think Lower Undead Berg always got a rough rap because of its association with Senor Capra Demon. but I actually like the claustrophobic energy that comes with running through the city's back streets. The lower burg is a nest of assassins and rogues. You're greeted by a flaming pile of charred wood and aggressive dogs that bound across the streets, for God's sake. As you walk down the road, you get ambushed as doors behind you fly open, the rogues now on the prowl. It's a linear path, there's not much in the way of exploration, but it works here. You just get to focus on the dangers ahead of you, or behind you in certain cases. The fact that this is the first area where enemies may be likely to fish for their own backstabs or parries is a nice difficulty boost, but once you learn how to funnel the enemies back down the path you've already walked, you should be able to handle them with somewhat ease. The Capra Demon, of course, is an infamous boss with artificial difficulty, in the sense that the enemy itself isn't tough, it's just the rather unfair nature of the arena, the camera, and the extra mobs that spawn in there. Once you get down to the underpass leading to the depths and the shortcut back to Firelink, things get a bit easier. You've got more space, and then it ends. In a modern FromSoft game, I think this area would overstay its welcome and have more branching level design, but given it's an extension of the Undead Burg and it's a bite-sized look at some tougher enemies, I think Lower Undead Burg ends at just the right point to keep it feeling memorable and fair. Just don't think too hard about the boss run back. Next up, I want to talk about Ash Lake, one of the 2 areas I forgot to include in the poll, as I firmly believe it would have landed around here-ish on the overall ranking. When you emerge into Ash Lake, the actual zone is relatively simple. You have a large sandbar path that you follow until you reach the Dragon Covenant at the very end, but I think the enemies and obstacles here are a tad bit more interesting and tougher to fight than, say, a Valley of the Drakes. We have a much stronger Hydra this time around, who you need to deal with immediately, as if you don't try to fight it, it'll follow you down the path and can even jump over the sandbar to attack you from the opposite side of the beach. The strategy is the same as the basin, but because of the lighting, it is so much easier to tell where you can stand safely in Ash Lake's water, which in my opinion makes this the easier fight. You also have to deal with deadly clams further along, which I find to be a tricky enemy type. They can hit hard, they're slightly faster than you'd expect, and I'm still traumatized from my Dark Souls randomizer let's play last year, where those clams took me out more than I care to admit. There's also one optional hollow tree which contains a few basilisks that's worth exploring, but the presence of enemies that can curse you is definitely a small boost to the difficulty scale for me, balanced out by the fact the clams can drop purging stones. It sounds like the developers were actually trying to be nice to players stuck in Ash Lake. It's one of my favorite areas visually in Soulspawn, such a striking skybox with such a unique theme, and I like that there isn't a lot of life down here, but the creatures we do find are inhospitable and very aggressive. It really makes you feel like you shouldn't be here. I just wish I had included it in the poll because I know so many people love an Ash Lake. Now, the Great Hollow, we'll get to that later, because there is no way I was going to do this ranking without talking about that place's bullshit difficulty. At number 15, we have The Depths, which scored a total average of 5.2 out of 10. This was a big surprise for me, as a few years ago when I first started making Soulspawn videos, it felt like the depths were considered extremely difficult, and I can see why. You're in a maze-like zone with multiple layers and a host of completely different enemies in each. There's the Butcher Warehouse, where you face regular hollows, fast-moving doggos, and 2 different butchers who act as tough little mini-bosses with those imposing hooded gazes. Then you have the upper sewers, which mainly features rats, and more rats, plus a few slimes for good measure, and the fact that the bonfire of the zone requires a key to unlock, which you have to progress further in the sewers to obtain, is a nice little difficulty spike to encourage exploration. Unless you pick the master key, but you know, if you're doing that, then you're not really having fun, are you? There's the lower sewers, which features a basilisk nest. These frog-like creatures have the ability to curse the player, and if you don't know they're there, you'll likely fall victim to that status effect. It halves your HP, and can only be cured by a purging stone or Ingvud in New Londo ruins. And there are holes that will drop you right into the middle of their nests if you're not careful. But on the flip side, the maze-like depths feels kind of like the Yoshi Valley of Dark Souls. Yoshi Valley is a Mario Kart track that infamously has a ton of different ways you can approach each lap, but everybody eventually figured out the fastest route. So for the depths, just drop behind this hole near the first butcher, kill the giant rat below, and then get on the ramp leading down, hugging the left wall so you don't fall into the hole, landing right where the staircase is that opens a shortcut to the bonfire door. But with the depths being situated right before Blighttown, it certainly gives it an easier feel by association. And thank goodness there is one voter who dedicated their comment to the depths, and they are a supporter. Hot take, but I really enjoy the depths. The labyrinthian nature of the place is enticing and calls to mind a dungeon crawler. I came to Dark Souls as my third game in the series, and I remember everyone and their cousin telling me to be wary of basilisks. Hearing them croaking as I trod the claustrophobic corridors was pretty mortifying until I found out how squishy they were. That said, if I hadn't had that prior warning, I think their breath attack and curse would be easy to succumb to when you're flailing about wondering what this new meter filling up is. The tight corridors and inconsistent terrain I think are most vital to the depth's difficulty. They throw you off balance and have you unprepared for what might happen around the next corner. And certainly, the points where you can just fall down to the next level at random don't help with that uncertainty either. It's why I found this topic interesting, as inevitably the areas are at their most difficult on a first run, when the uncertainty can leave you vulnerable to most traps and obstacles. So I think the depths are a lovely midpoint of difficulty. The terrain is unstable and difficult to navigate, and on a first run you're liable to get lost, but on repeat playthroughs, you're conscious of the dangerous pitfalls. So we'll take it cautiously, and we'll be more willing to explore and find all the secrets it has to offer. For me, anyway. A very unbiased and well thought out response right here. I love that you acknowledged both a first time player and a repeat player's potential experiences, and how the depths manages to hit a nice middle ground with its difficulty. This is definitely reflected in how the depths got a 5.2 in the rankings, smack bang in the middle of the metric, and probably correct for its point in the game. My only note is that the pitfalls you can fall down aren't really random. They're all in those cramped tunnels past the channeler, and as long as you're not rushing, you should be able to see them. But FromSoft strategically placed rat enemies on the other side of some of these holes to get you to make a mistake, see and attack an enemy only to slip up. I think that's really smart. At number 14, we have the Demon Ruins, which scored a total average of 5.3 out of 10. We're starting to hit the mid to late game areas, and I don't think players have a strong opinion on the Demon Ruins from a difficulty perspective, which makes a lot of sense. Initially, you have to fight an incredibly easy boss in Ceaseless Discharge, which allows you to lower the lava level and progress through the ruins themselves. Most of the enemies are Kappa and Taurus demons, which you fought in the past, thus making them much easier to deal with now. The rock worms that burrow out of the walls, while they can royally mess you up, are often placed in areas that leave them easy to run past, with the only danger spots being the one guarding a bonfire midway through the level, and the corridor leading to one of the Blacksmith Ember upgrades. Honestly, running down to the Demon Fire Sage isn't that tough, with you just needing to roll past a couple enemies to reach the Fog Gate. The slight difficulty here, I think, comes from the fact that the enemies, if they do land hits on you, will cause a lot of damage, and many of them are quite tanky. I'd also say the two major bosses, the Fire Sage and the Centipede Demon, are surprisingly tough in their own ways. Fire Sage has a ton of roots in their boss arena that can catch your rolls, so you can't get away from the AoEs in time, while Centipede Demon just has one of the worst arenas in the series. It's infinitely cooler in Elden Ring Night Rain though. While Demon Ruins isn't a well-designed area and very lazily put together, I can at least see why it's here in the middle of a difficulty ranking, because it doesn't have the level of irritating enemy placements and environmental hazards that some of our later entries have. It's also just a short zone in comparison, which means you'll be done with it sooner rather than later. At number 13, we have Lost Izalith, which scored a total average of 5.38 out of 10, with the second highest amount of votes for least favourite area. But similarly to the Demon Ruins, while Lost Izalith is certainly an infamously bad area from the series, it's not really because of the difficulty. Entering from the regular entrance, you have the orange charred ring, so you can walk along the lava and follow the various routes to eventually reach the hidden bonfire on the lava lake. Though if we were judging the very first edition of Dark Souls, I think players would realize that every undead dragon within a 60-mile radius would aggro onto the player, making the lava lake near impossible to pass through. It's crazy what a ton of patches in a remaster can do for an area's reputation. Once you reach the main dome of Lost Izalith, I don't think it's particularly hard. You've got those stone statue gargoyles that try to sneak up behind you to flamethrower your ass. You've got a few Chaos Eaters, both above ground and in the hidden underground poison area where you continue Siegmeyer's questline. There's a single Pyromancer guarding the boss door, and of course we have the Titanite demon that guards the bridge leading to Solaire, the Chaos Bugs, and the Daughters of Chaos shortcut. None of these creatures on their own pose a terrible threat, aside from maybe the Titanite demon. That thing can one-shot at a high level. And then the boss is the boss. Bed of Chaos is all about learning the arena and learning the actually quite predictable pattern of its swipes and stabs. So in that sense, it's just more level to learn. There's no real crazy difficulty spikes here, just a level that doesn't feel that inspired, is definitely unfinished, and which was patched to high heaven because its original state was actually unplayable and unfair. I imagine my voters have a couple thoughts, so let's jump in. For me, Lost Izalith is definitely one of the hardest areas in the game, but unfortunately this area suffers from an artificial difficulty, with a huge amount of annoying enemies that just frustrates your gameplay. This isn't like other areas like Painted World of Ariamis that are hard but in a fun and fair way. In Lost Izalith you just face an enemy spam with boring enemies, a terrible boss, and being forced to use one of your 2 ring slots just to navigate this place. It's hard, unfair, and frustrating. Sorry for the bad English, and kisses from Brazil. While I don't personally agree with the enemy spam comment, as I honestly think it's quite easy to run past a lot of them, I do agree that the fact you have to give up a ring slot can be brutal for people who rely on 2 rings for their builds. I also agree that the difficulty doesn't feel natural. Now, artificial difficulty is a buzzword that is often thrown around by people to explain difficulty they feel is unfair or manufactured. For me, this artificial difficulty comes in the way that enemies are placed without much thought. You have to stealth your way across the lava lake lest you anger the dragon butts, and I feel that element of difficulty could have been implemented in a much cleaner way had the developers had some time to finish this area. I did actually get a couple comments in the voting where people were saying FromSoft were lazy for the way they designed this area, and I just want to say I really dislike that language because we all know the pressures that come with crunch and how it affects gaming studios. You can't avoid it nowadays. We also know that Dark Souls, as it was being developed, wasn't this global phenomenon yet. Modern FromSoftware could get away with having a deadline extension to tighten up their games, but the FromSoftware that was developing Dark Souls were just trying to survive. They had no choice but to release their game when they did, and it only takes reading a couple of developer interviews to see just how much they regretted that they couldn't bring forth the vision they wanted for areas like Lost Izalith. So give 2011 FromSoft some grace. They weren't lazy just because a part of the game was rushed. At number 12, we have the Crystal Cave, which scored a total average of 5.41 out of 10, with the 3rd most amount of votes for least favorite area. Crystal Cave to me is very similar to the Demon Ruins in that it's not a particularly large area in the game. It's mostly linear, with a single path you need to follow to reach the boss, with a handful of extra treasure to find if you're feeling very adventurous. And yet, it is difficult, and the terrain is far more volatile to navigate. The biggest gimmick here are the invisible bridges. You have to watch the crystal shards that fall from the ceiling as they land on the invisible pathways, which will then tell you how you can progress. As a longtime player, I know where all the paths are, so I can run this area like it's nothing, but a new player is gonna struggle here. On top of that, many of the crystals you run across are slanted and have this weird collision when it comes to the player. It's very easy to slip off the side of this central crystal and tumble into oblivion for absolutely no reason. There shouldn't be an excuse for this. Then, right before the boss fog, you have a rabid group of clams that you need to kill before you can access the arena, as if you run into that arena trying to skip those clams on your very first attempt, one of them can actually get caught in the boss arena, causing your first attempt with Seath and his cursed crystals to really ramp up in difficulty. Once the fog gate exists for repeat attempts, you don't have to worry about this happening, but it's a funny moment nonetheless. Crystal Cave doesn't have a lot to it, but I think it's a tad obnoxious as an area, and with 0 bonfires within, you're having to do the full gauntlet every time you die to Seath, which, yes, it helps you learn the lay of the land, but it also just starts to drive players nuts. It's hard in its own way, but not in a way that feels intentional or traditional. Crystal Cave is both the hardest area for me and my least favourite, largely because I hate the clams of Spiky Doom outside the boss fog, but mostly because of the invisible paths. Yes, now we know about finding the way with arrows or just from memory, but it was brutal for a long time. It's just a slog of avoiding the falls while killing golems and then getting past those clam monsters. And if you fall to Seath, that run back is a drag. People rag on Izalith, but it's a warm day in the sun compared to the cave. Oh, my sweet voter. Based on what you said, you didn't even know about the crystals that fall on the invisible bridges? I can't imagine how painful it was to use the arrow strategy to get to the end. Oh my god, baby. At number 11, we have the Royal Wood, which scored a total average of 5.76 out of 10. I'm not surprised to see this area in the upper half of the list, as with the Royal Wood containing 0 bonfires and one shortcut you only unlock at the very end of the area, it means you've got to get through from start to finish. I like to fully explore this area nowadays, as I find the extra side paths and perilous jumps you have to make pretty fun, and there are some nice items scattered about. The enemy types are simple enough that you won't be too overwhelmed, but difficult enough to welcome you to the DLC. The Stone Guardians, who are now in their prime, terrify me, and I still have nightmares from some of them because of my experiences in the Dark Souls randomizer I did last year, and the Scarecrow Soldiers are really fun designs that I think are super neat. Because of their colouring, they actually blend into the environment, making them good for ambushing the player. Later on, you also have the Calamite Chasm with a couple doggos to just remind us how much dogs suck, and we have 2 fairly difficult bosses to face as well, Artorias and Calamite. It's a harder version of Darkroot with more enemies around to ensure that you don't just run past everything, but you still can. With its larger area size, I can see why people find it harder than a Crystal Cave or a Demon Ruins, where those areas take less time to run through. Though the difficulty ranking is still in the 5s, which I think means Royal Wood is a tad undertuned, perhaps a third enemy type that was a bit faster could have worked wonders, or why don't we just throw a couple giant cats into the mix? I'm just making suggestions. At number 10, we have the Chasm of the Abyss, which scored a total average of 5.92 out of 10. I'd say this is the last of the areas that feel a little difficult, but not too much, as every other area on this list amps the difficulty up significantly. Chasm of the Abyss is tough because of its confusing layout, where on your first visit you'll have no idea where to go, alongside a tough selection of enemies to hamper your progress. We have the bloated Ulasil residents, melee and mage, who can easily gang up on the player to get a quick kill. The mages and their Darkbead spell are the most dangerous, I always try to avoid them, but then as you delve deeper into the chasm, you discover humanity sprites, and suddenly, they're the apex predator here. Humanity sprites damage you on contact, and sometimes your weapon might launch you forward slightly into their damage range before your attack can come out, making them very difficult to fight against. Combo that with how much they can bunch up around the player, and suddenly you have the potential to get swarmed and destroyed, your health bar being negated before you can finish blinking. Of course, if people were including bosses, I think Manus certainly brings the difficulty of this area up a tad. His run back is a little tricky at first when you don't know the route, but once you've got a path in your mind, I think it's quite easy to get back to him. But that doesn't change that you'll be running through the Chasm of the Abyss quite a lot. Before we reach the top 9, I just want to quickly go over the Great Hollow. The connective area between Blighttown and Ash Lake, this is a purely vertical level that tasks you with platforming down a hollow tree until you reach its depths. The hardest part of this level is the first half, that's where all the platforming takes place, and because every single branch looks the same, it's hard to recall what the route is for getting further down. Some items require tricky drops and jumps that, if failed, will immediately kill you, which isn't fun for anyone here. Then there's the horror of the basilisks. They return in the Great Hollow at multiple points, and should you be cursed, there are no purging stones nearby to help heal you. You'll have to just try and get to Ash Lake so you can kill some clams for theirs. I always get nervous here because once you reach the halfway point, the terrain gets a bit finicky and slippy, which can mess up your rolls and potentially even have you falling to your doom through surprise tiny holes. The last part of the area is easier by comparison, as you just have to deal with a mushroom family, and yes, while the big mushrooms will destroy you with a single hit, you can run past them, you can space them out, and you've got more room to handle them than you did the basilisks above. The other pain of the Great Hollow is climbing back out. Without the Lord Vessel, you have to go through all those enemies again, but on top of that, you'll also find one random platform atop a ladder with awful geometry that can only be passed by rolling in a very specific spot, and that is just unhinged. This level was almost a soft lock, and it never got fixed in the remastered edition. But while I despise the Great Hollow and I think its vertical nature definitely gets it in the top 10 here, I think the upcoming areas are all more diverse and challenging in a more traditional way. At number 9, we have the Painted World of Ariamis, which scored a total average of 6.23 out of 10, and I would say this is the first area where I really disagree with the ranking. I think the Painted World should be higher on this list, and let me explain why I think that. Firstly, we have a troublesome set of enemies. Pyromancer hollows that can launch fireballs from afar, the crow demons who often ambush players on higher ledges, an entire courtyard filled with phalanx hoplites who are very difficult to kill in this specific area, and lest we forget the sewers of Bonewheel. On top of that, Ariamis is a level you can't really skip through. You have to explore the upper left buildings, making your way across them until you reach the central tower and the lower courtyard, and with a lot of narrow paths ripe for weapons bonking off the walls, as well as some ambush setups, you might not make the shortcut with all your Estus intact. It doesn't help that you're locked into Ariamis once you arrive, only able to leave via the boss arena with Priscilla, and you have to unlock that boss arena by heading into the lower waterways and surviving the Bonewheel skeleton room. Those thin tunnels that lead off that area are a death trap, plain and simple. Ariamis is a great level though, the difficulty feels correct for a hidden zone, and there are so many extra goodies to find across the different paths you can explore. There's even an undead dragon you can slay on the far off bridge. It may just be me, but I really struggle with the enemies every time I come here, so I'm curious to see how my voters feel. It's not my least favourite area in the game, but I wanted to talk about my experience with the Painted World of Ariamis. I just arrived at Anor Londo, so excited, probably the area I was looking forward to the most. But then, I accidentally ended up in the Painted World, only to realise there was no easy way out. Not sure what to expect, I entered a dilemma. I wanted to get out of there ASAP to go back to my beloved Anor Londo, but at the same time I wanted to explore every nook and cranny of that place because that's just what I like to do. The result was utterly abysmal. Just about every single enemy in there made me so pissed, especially the Pyromancer hollows. Why do they toxic you instantly? The crow demons, tanky and hard-hitting as fuck, and I can't even begin to describe my nightmares with the Bonewheel skeletons room. Everything was awful. When I finally arrived at Priscilla's boss arena, my first thoughts were, thank fucking god I can finally leave this hellhole. I was so relieved when I got back to Anor Londo, and I never wanted to go back there again, which I ended up doing anyway, haha. I'm sure that on a replay I might end up liking this area much more, but for now there's only trauma and pain. Anyways, that was my experience, love your content very much, and greetings from Brazil. This is a really interesting take because I don't think I've heard a lot of stories about people who found their way into the Painted World pre-Lord Vessel. It makes sense, you went back to the asylum early, got the peculiar doll, and accidentally activated the Painted World during your first visit to Anor Londo, and in that sense I see why you struggled. Painted World may be in Anor Londo, but I don't feel the enemies are scaled with Anor Londo in mind. They feel tougher, like you should get some Lord Soul fragments first before coming to clear this area out. Poison pyromancers, crow demons, bone wheels, you did the gauntlet, and I'm glad I'm not delusional when I say I think they're very hard enemies in a very tough area. Well designed, but hard. Something most voters agree with, as they did rank it as their second favourite area in the game, behind Anor Londo, which I don't think comes as a shock to anybody, except this one voter. I will never understand the love of the Painted World. Priscilla and the Demon Souls references are the only good points. I don't like the enemy design or placements. We all know the Bone Wheel Maze is annoying as fuck. Don't get me started on the fact there's no checkpoint. You're locked there if you accidentally aggro Priscilla and die. I hate the trek to her. I hate how dimly lit the place is and how washed out it looks. I just really don't enjoy it. It's merely a weak lore drop area and nothing more. Now, if you had a bad experience with the Painted World, you are fully entitled to those feelings. I also feel the enemies are the worst part of this area. I said as much in my Dark Souls area ranking from 2023. However, I do think the level design is pretty well done. It's a puzzle box with Demon Souls level design that, rather than giving you checkpoints upon checkpoints, they ask you to work your way around and unlock shortcuts back to the initial singular bonfire. The area isn't that big either, it's just very vertical, which gives the illusion that it's larger and longer than you think. I'd also argue that the trek to Priscilla isn't an issue, when this game has runbacks like Seath, Bed of Chaos, Nito, Manus, Iron Golem. I don't know, I think a very straight path with barely any dangerous enemies to stop you isn't that bad in comparison, but that's just me trying to be objective. Either way, this area is difficult, I'm just surprised at how many areas are still above it. At number 8, we have the Oolacile Township, which scored a total average of 6.89 out of 10. The hardest of the DLC zones, and one of my personal favourite areas in the game, Oolacile Township is an interesting level. It's split into the upper town and the lower town, with the upper half focusing on the winding staircases that lead down to the Mimic Chest and the large buildings below, with a host of small side streets with slightly scary jumps and enemies hidden around corners, while the lower half focuses on this large expansive building and the darkened corridors at the depths of the chasm which eventually lead to the Oolacile dungeons. In the upper half, you meet the new enemy types, bloated melee and bloated dark mage enemies, but they're used fairly sporadically. The melee enemies can be shielded, while the dark mages always have a little laugh after their magic, which gives you time to approach. I'm not a fan of the way they can sometimes be placed behind corners you can't see, but it's very rare that happens. The second half is where you have to put your skills to the test though, as the game throws enemy gauntlets at you with the intention of trying to catch you out, with that last portion before the arena with the chained prisoner being my personal hell. Two mages trying to shoot you, but you've got melee enemies trying to kill you. There's not a lot of room to hide. It is a brutal section, made easier by the fact they do give you an elevator shortcut mere moments before. And that's what I like about the township. It makes you work for that shortcut by going through everything the level has to offer, but at no point does the level feel truly unfair. It's DLC, it needs to be endgame scaled, and I think the difficulty is around what it needs to be to keep players invested. Remember, at this point in the game, you have the Rite of Kindling, and you likely have a ton of humanity, so there's no excuse to not be estusing your bonfires up to +20. The one area I genuinely struggled with in an okay, this is challenging, how do I best deal with this way, was Oolacile, an area I really liked. The enemies are kind of creepy, and they appear in great numbers, but are usually not too overwhelming. Also, the melee guys are simple enough to take out. When combined with the mages, that's when it can get hairy, but moments like this weren't the norm in the area, so I didn't get tired of that trope. I think that this was one of the few times in Dark Souls where the enemies felt like credible threats, but not like miserable slogs that drag the entire area down, an issue I think most Souls games, even the ones I really love, often struggle with. Definite agree right there. Obviously everybody's experiences are different. I'm sure some people hate the enemies here and that's okay, but I really feel they're simple enough that they don't overwhelm players, while having enough setup potential that each new room or layout of enemies always felt enticing to take on. Compare this to Blighttown and the tanky ogres mixed in with the toxic blow dart enemies, and you can see where one area succeeds at being fun, while the other can seem more like a sluggish experience. At number 7, we have the Catacombs, which scored a total average of 7.02 out of 10. I am very vindicated in seeing this area so high on the list, because I always find myself struggling to get through it regardless of my playthrough or when I enter. Now of course there are shortcuts to get to the bottom so you can fight Pinwheel extremely quickly, but that's not what we're ranking, as not every player has the skill level to pull those shortcuts off when a lot of them aren't necessarily intended. The main challenge of the Catacombs are these necromancers that constantly revive the skeletons in each segment. They don't respawn, meaning once you kill a necromancer you never have to worry about them again, but by god they can be well hidden down secret passages or some such. And with the amount of skeletons and traps on offer to try and slow your progress, plus a little sneaky hee hee ha ha moment from patches on one of the bridges, you might find the Catacombs a bit tougher than you first think. Then you reach the lower portion where you might fall into a room with a Black Knight, and let's not forget everybody's favourite part, the Bone Wheel Skeleton Chasm, where in order to reach Pinwheel you need to outrun or kill these dastardly creatures. Now Remastered makes this a bit easier by including a bonfire at Varmos, the skeletal blacksmith, assuming you can nail the platforming challenge leading into his tomb, which then leads directly into the lowest part of the Catacombs. But that also means skipping a ton of loot, so you kind of have to decide what you covet more. This is one of the larger areas in the game, very twisty-turny. There are a lot of levers to pull, areas to drop down, statues that will stab you. Overall, it's a brutal challenge, especially if you stumble in here from Firelink at the very start of the game, which many players have done in the past. Trying to escape the Catacombs can be a brutal challenge in itself if you don't have warping unlocked. And yet, I think the difficulty here is quite fair. It's tougher than average, showcasing that you don't need to come here from the start of the game, while also being a nice challenge that doesn't overstay its welcome in the late game. Once you know the layout of the area, it can be quite fun to navigate, and looks so much better in comparison to the area that follows. We'll get there later. At number 6, we have the Duke's Archives, which scored a total average of 7.13 out of 10. When I think of late game Dark Souls, I picture the various areas, Lost Izalith, Tomb of the Giants, New Londo Ruins, and I always find myself leaving the Duke's Archives for later, because I think it really kills the momentum of the game for me by being very slow. To start with, you face 2 Ironborn mini-bosses before even reaching the first bonfire. Then you go through a massive library where a channeler is buffing every enemy in the room, making every arrow a potential 2-shot kill, every melee attack a potential 1-shot kill, and the only way to progress is up a series of narrow staircases. Then you're forced to lose a fight against Seath that could get you cursed even after you die, and it will get you arrested in the prison tower, which is a tedious affair as you run down the staircase, shut off the music, find the key that lets you escape, and go back into the main archives, where you then play musical staircases. The path to progression here is obtuse, and with the archives looking pretty identical, I can't blame people for getting lost here. I certainly was when I was younger. Combined with a host of very annoying channelers firing magic, as well as some fairly tanky regular crystal hollows, and you have a location that will kill you far more often than not. It takes so long to get through, mistakes can be very costly, and the non-linearity, while certainly a good thing for a game that encourages exploration, ends up wearing thin this late into the experience. I leave Seath for last on most playthroughs because I find the Duke's Archives to be difficult and a little too scripted in how you progress. Not to mention, when you're in the prison tower, you can't warp from that bonfire, which is a small difficulty spike until you escape. At least the Crystal Garden is pretty chill, the one moment of calm in the archives before you enter the Crystal Cave and go back to hating this entire portion of the game. I'd personally rather do Lost Izalith, because despite being a bad area, I can at least blitz through it relatively quickly. Duke's Archives isn't the hardest area in the game, but there's something about that draws you away. And my one voter who discussed the archives agrees with me. The Duke's Archives, a place I hated with my entire being. It wasn't the hardest thing in the world, but I'd rather smash my head against a wall than ever go back there. The funny magic guys made it much more jarring than it had to be, especially with how many there were and how annoying magic is in general. 0 out of 10, would not recommend for a vacation. The channelers are just so obnoxious here, which is even more frustrating if you go for the 100% run, as you need a specific weapon drop from them that is incredibly rare, and the farming route for them is pretty much non-existent. Difficulty in a different sense. At number 5, we have Blighttown, which scored a total average of 7.21 out of 10. Considered to be one of the toughest zones in early Soulsborne, Blighttown was infamous among early adopters of Dark Souls due to the atrocious frame rate when exploring, as well as the host of relatively difficult enemies for that stage of the game. You have very strong barbarian ogres who can tank a lot of hits and don't get staggered easily. You have aggressive ghouls that are effectively the regular hollows of this area, except they hit harder, faster, and have better tracking. The flaming attack dogs, while there aren't many on either side of Blighttown, can do quick damage with their fire breath if they get close, and combined with the blow dart snipers that hide among the rafters, it is a perilous trip down to the swamp. Blighttown has so much tricky platforming that gravity will often take you out first. Not to mention, navigation is purposefully confusing and definitely obtuse for new players. And if you do manage to get down the maze of wooden beams, you eventually reach a swamp that limits your movement severely. That is, unless you have the rusted iron ring from the asylum, in which case you're having a great time. For the rest of you, having to roll away from mosquitoes and crag spiders and leeches is just not a particularly exciting time. I don't personally mind it myself, but that doesn't change that it's not a difficult area to navigate. It is. Even exiting via the water wheel is a brutal climb, because if you want an optional Firekeeper soul, which you definitely do want, you have to deal with a combo of flame dogs and toxic dart blowers, which is just over the limit of what I and most players want to deal with. Blighttown does exactly what it sets out to do, provide a genuinely hostile area that sets a tone for the lower half of Lordran, but it goes so far on the difficulty scale that it definitely has the ability to scare away newer players and veterans alike. I said the depths with its 5.2 was a fair rating for that point in the game. Blighttown is the next area, and it's a whole 2 points higher on today's difficulty scale. That says it all, at least to me. But what about our voters? Blighttown might be my favorite area. The aesthetic is fantastic, and it feels appropriate for an area even deeper than the depths. The build up to this area is incredible. When you first encounter Blighttown, you've been spending the past few hours just descending through Undead Burg, with each area getting progressively scarier, from the city of the dead above, to the murderous streets below, to the sewers inhabiting ungodly creatures like basilisks and the Gaping Dragon. When you get to Blighttown, the door is locked, and to progress you need the key guarded by the dragon. Then you read the key's item description and it tells you that Blighttown was locked away to contain a decay so scary, even the people of the depths were terrified. The very moment you get to Blighttown, the colors all go green and you start questioning your life choices. Mechanically speaking, Blighttown is also fantastic. The upper half is an incredibly well-connected township with fun enemies that reward mechanical mastery. Chain backstabbing the ogres will never stop being fun, and although the toxic dart shooters used to feel so oppressive that they ruined any exploration for me, I eventually realized that I could use the ogres' dung pies to poison myself and thus become immune to toxic, which blew my mind. That is insane. Ah yes, you can't toxic me if I mildly poison myself first by eating dung. Miyazaki, is this what you intended for all along? I firmly agree that Blighttown, both aesthetically and mechanically, is a really solid area that just needed time for people to come around to it. It's definitely gotten more popular over the years, which, thank God, I don't think I could survive another decade of Blighttown is an awful area discourse. But there is one voter that feels Blighttown isn't as hard as it's claimed to be. Blighttown is very well known for being a pain to go through, and while part of me can understand that, I have to disagree. Obviously there are difficult sections, the big fuck on the wall, that one room with like 800 dogs and dart boys, the barbarians with boulders, but I don't think it's that bad overall. Due to there not being too much space in the slums, the enemy groups aren't really that big. Personally, I rarely have trouble with gravity, which doesn't seem to be something most people can say. The enemies aren't that hard to deal with the exceptions of the barbarians and the dark guys. The poison swamp is fairly empty, so the main threat is your health bar ticking down. As for quality, Blighttown is probably my second favorite area in Souls. So far, I haven't played much of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 2. Visually, it's amazing, it's just the right size, and I always have a blast exploring the slums. The verticality is always a plus. I don't mind poison swamps too much, and I adore the view you get from looking up at the sky at the entrance to Quelaag's domain. It also has my favourite weapon in the game, the Iaito. The duality of Soulsborne players, ladies and gentlemen. I do like the point that the slums can never overly ambush you just due to the space there is to place enemies, while also simultaneously pointing out some valid moments where the area is hard, like the dog and dart blower room. That's very unbiased of you, good job. I never found the boulder barbarians to be tough though. Am I alone in thinking they're pretty easy to avoid? Let me know in the comments. At number 4, we have the New Londo Ruins, which scored a total average of 7.3 out of 10. The New Londo Ruins are similar to the Catacombs in that it's very easy to run into their area from the start of the game, just one simple elevator ride from Firelink. One that is encouraged due to the very early Firekeeper soul you can find right near the entrance. But an area that is tough because its main initial enemy types are immune to any sort of damage except Curse. Either you become cursed by a basilisk, you use the transient curse items which can be found in pots at the entrance of the area, or you use the Ghost Blade, Jagged Ghost Blade, or Cursed Greatsword of Artorias. Basically stock up on transient curses as you can purchase them from the female undead merchant in the Aqueduct, or from Ingvard later in the level. These ghosts will ambush and destroy you if you're not careful. They can come from any direction, and the ghost house that Ingvard stands atop is considered one of the toughest parts of the game for new players. You wander in, and every ghost in a 5-mile radius homes in on your location like you're at RuPaul's DragCon and your phone pings with a grinder sound effect. Then, if you lower the water level, you're faced with another set of tough enemies, the Dark Wraiths. While they can be parried, they are a dangerous foe that deals solid damage and can even steal your humanity with their grab attack. If multiple attack at the same time, run away and pray. You also have the massive souls that don't respawn, but can summon wisps that explode upon close contact to the player. These creatures are horrifying and can often be found alongside Dark Wraiths, making for a couple tricky but fun setups. New Londo is an area that feels like a maze because it's never fully clear where you are or how everything connects on a first playthrough, and there are so many ways that your exploration can go wrong. It makes me wonder just what my voters fear so much. New Londo Ruins was, and still is, one of the most memorable areas in this game. While the series has areas that use ghosts/wraiths as enemies, the Undead Crypt and Shaded Woods from Dark Souls 2 come to mind, the sheer oppressive nature of the New Londo ghosts plague me every time I'm here regardless of my build. They can swarm you from almost anywhere, there is almost no room where you are completely safe from their knives or lightning, their screams make every turn haunting, making me turn my camera to see whether or not I'm being pursued, they can float through walls and up ladders, which is more harrowing since you can't quickly ascend ladders in this game. Meeting Ingvard while providing brief respite is quite morose when you know what he and the other sealers had to do to try and contain the abyss. And when you release the water and gain access to the lower part of the city, you are met with the rotting corpses of the entire citizenry, piles upon piles of bodies. It is the most chilling scene I've ever experienced in the entire of the trilogy. In the midst of this, Dark Wraiths stalk you from the shadows, ready to cut you down and steal your humanity. The massive souls block your path, ready to spear you with their tongue or blow you away with wisps. And this is all before you face the Four Kings and meet Karth, if you don't engage with Frampt. While the Dark is, in my opinion, filled with sinister forces that the player probably doesn't grasp the full nature of, it is truly staggering to see firsthand the atrocities Gwyn committed to keep it at bay. Yeah, there really is something about draining that moat and seeing the corpses piled up under the water. It really contextualizes why there are so many ghosts in the first half of the zone, and why it feels like they swarm you when you enter. They're all vengeful, unable to move on. I especially like the note on the ladders, as we've all likely tried to rush through the ghost house to Ingvad, only to get knocked off the ladder by a stray ghost knife. It's also worth noting that New Londo doesn't have any traditional checkpoints. The two closest bonfires are Firelink Shrine and the Cavern in the Darkroot Basin, both of which provide fair jumping off points for entering the area, but certainly don't provide any shortcuts for exploring once the water is drained. It makes for a confusing yet exciting area where you're constantly at war with pushing on or pulling back. At number 3, we have Anor Londo, which scored a total average of 7.51 out of 10. And I'm going into my hot take era. I think Anor Londo is a tale of two very different difficulties. The first half of the level, which features you trying to get into the Great Cathedral, is a genuinely challenging experience. You have two gargoyles that you rematch against, with the side building where you carefully walk along the rafters in between those encounters. Trying to block painting guardians and actually survive the walk to the far side is some of the most nerve-wracking gameplay in any Dark Souls playthrough. Though if you have a shield, you do have at least a way to block those attacks from hitting you. Then you have the bat demons with their electricity that hits through your defenses and are really annoying to fight, before finally ending with the infamous Anor Londo archers. What else can I say other than that they are feared for a reason? New players won't know how to parry the main archer or the strategies needed to get past them, and I wouldn't be shocked if the entire high difficulty of this zone comes from these two Silver Knights. Because once you get inside, Anor Londo becomes really easy. The only enemy types you encounter from that point on are more Silver Knights and a few Royal Sentinels in the main hall, plus one optional Titanite demon. And with a fairly useful bonfire here, you don't have an excuse to not learn the parry timings of these knights. The sword wielders are so easy to parry compared to a lot of enemies in this game, and the spear wielders, while their parry timing catches me off guard a bit, just isn't that difficult in the long run. Learn to fight these guys well, and the second half of this map is completely neutered in difficulty. And you have nothing better to do since you're locked to the bonfire near Sleipnir until you either open the cathedral doors or beat Ornstein and Smo to obtain the Lord Vessel. I don't know, I suspect Anor Londo really gets a difficulty boost here because of its tough boss fight at the end. I don't take those into account when ranking areas, as I want the level design and enemy placements to speak for themselves, but right now I need the voters to speak for themselves. Anyone? Anor Londo, let's be honest, that first view was incredible. The chandelier fights with guardians, beautiful. The majesty of the Silver Knights, perfection. The Arrow Knights, okay, well they're awful, but aside from those guys, it's a near perfect level. That's the only comment I got on Anor Londo in my voter comments. Given it was the clear favorite area of the game for my voters, I was kind of hoping for more people to justify the really high difficulty ranking, but I genuinely will never know whether my theory that the first half is more difficult and impactful versus the second half is true or not. Or maybe we can just kill Guinevere, unspawn all the enemies, and give the area a 1 for difficulty. At number 2, we have Sen's Fortress, which scored a total average of 7.6 out of 10. The Takeshi's Castle of Lordran. When I started this poll, I knew Sen's Fortress would land at least in the top 5. So I'm quite happy to see it at number 2, as I really do feel this is the pinnacle of fair difficulty in Dark Souls. Sen's Fortress is a trap house, filled to the brim with dangerous traps and enemies to make your life a living hell. It accurately depicts the experience of going through customs when you land in a new country, aggressive and irritated workers and all. I like that the first room really emphasizes the main challenges here, swinging axes on thin bridges, and an introduction to the two main snake enemies you'll face, alongside a couple sneaky arrow traps for good measure so you're aware to keep an eye out. Then you get introduced to the boulder run and your aim becomes how to stop the boulders from falling, and I like that there's not one route to reach the top of the fortress. You can run down this left boulder track to the room with the first mimic in the game, then take the deadly elevator upwards, or you can drop onto these wooden platforms on the left path and take a side route that ultimately leads to the same location but with less potential deaths. Then you have another corridor with arrow traps and a couple more deadly axe bridges you need to cross in order to reach the rooftops. This whole level is an exercise in player tension, as you're constantly wondering when you'll finally get through the worst of the obstacles, and every setup is more difficult than the last. Knowing that any false move will likely see you plummeting to your death, resetting the entire fortress, is definitely motivation to play cautiously. But if you make it to the top, there's a hidden bonfire off this rooftop that you can use to checkpoint yourself. Absolutely messed up that most people can and will miss it with no prior knowledge, which adds to the difficulty. Even more so when the shortcut you can unlock just leaves you on a bridge with enemies at the start of the level. What the fuck, FromSoft? Easily one of my favorite areas to explore in the game, but by god do they push the limits of your sanity. Taking on and beating Sen's Fortress really makes you feel like you can overcome anything, and this really is the pinnacle of difficulty, if not for one late game area. I've never understood why Sen's Fortress is considered one of the absolute hardest in the game. It's very punishing if you screw it up, but is otherwise fairly simple if you take your time and observe the traps. Voter, you kind of answered your own question. It's punishing if you screw up. If you take your time, you won't. Not to generalize, but I don't think a lot of Soulsborne players are known for being very patient or taking their time. Not to mention, quite a few of the traps feel like they're designed to catch you out that first time. I really feel as a long-time player that my knowledge of Sen's Fortress lowers that difficulty for me significantly, whereas I recall my first playthrough and many other players' first playthroughs, and this place absolutely bodied us. Most of the trap types haven't been introduced in the game prior to this, so to some people they just come out of nowhere and can feel really punishing. But hey, I'm glad you, my dear voter, had a good time. Sen's Fortress is a pretty incredible area. The traps are extremely deadly, especially when you have no idea what is going on during your first playthrough, but it stays challenging every following playthrough since the Snake Boys are some of the toughest enemies in the game, especially with how relatively early you fight them. And fuck those giants throwing explosives at you when you run to the second bonfire or to the boss. They 100% have killed me more than the wobbly iron golem could ever dream of. Super fun and well-designed area though. How could I have forgotten about the giants and their bombs on the roof? Take too long to line your drop down to the hidden bonfire and you might just have a bomb to face. You didn't kill the giant before the boss fight? Bomb to the face while fighting the iron golem. I actually agree with the comment on the snakes as well. They're a tricky enemy type and I definitely struggle with the melee variants. The mages I can flatten, but the regular snakes are tanky and really make Sen's Fortress feel like an upgrade to where you've been before. At number 1, we have the Tomb of the Giants, which scored a total average of 8.39 out of 10, the area that got the most votes for hardest and least favorite. When I started this poll, I knew this would be number 1, and I was ready for it, because by god, there is nothing more infuriating than an area that leaves you in pitch black for its runtime. Tomb of the Giants requires that you either have the Skull Lantern or the Sunlight Maggot on hand, otherwise you're just gonna have a miserable time. There are giant skeleton warriors that will cut you down through the gloom, there are massive skeletal dogs that will bound towards you and absolutely demolish your stamina and health bar in a couple hits, there are archers hidden in the dark that can snipe you from unknown directions, and even a goddamn Black Knight who thought that was okay. You get 2 bonfires here, though the second is relatively hidden, and your goal is just to reach Gravelord Nito alive. Except even if you maneuver through the darkest part of the zone, you then have to run through a room filled with pinwheel spam and skeletal babies that will not stop spawning, culminating in forced fall damage into the boss arena. Imagine getting to the Tomb of the Giants before unlocking the Lord Vessel. Maybe you're new to the game, you beat Blighttown and thought, let's just check those catacombs again. I could probably win there now. Now you're in the bonfire at the Tomb of the Giants with no way to warp out and no light source. The Skull Lantern can be picked up from Patch's Pit, which I guess is a small convenience, I'll give the game that. But even when you can see, it's just not a very fun area to explore. It's maze-like, and the verticality can be very confusing. You might think one path is another, or you'll run into more enemies you can barely see from the firelight. It's so easy to just walk off the edge by mistake into the void, with your only senses of direction being the skybox for Lost Izalith, hinting you're near the start, and the skybox for Ash Lake, hinting you're near the end. And God forbid you have to climb out of this area without warping. It's a miserable experience, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemies. I've learned the route through Tomb of the Giants against my will. Not to mention, if you use the Skull Lantern, you lose access to using a shield, which the enemies like the skeleton dogs could really use the player having a shield to mitigate that insane damage output. Alright voters, time for you to take control. Tomb of the Giants feels overtuned by quite a bit. Every enemy hits like a truck, and you lack the vision to properly combat groups. You have 2 options for light: 1, getting the wormy helmet that gives off some light, and 2, getting the lamp you're supposed to hold in your offhand. But both of these options suck. The worm doesn't give off much light, and the lamp takes up your shield slot, which leaves you very vulnerable against the most dangerous enemies in Dark Souls 1, the huge undead dogs. These things are way too fast. Their attacks come out before anyone could reasonably react to them, which makes it a pain to combat them, especially when you have to give up your shield for the lamp. The area is also full of holes, which means your mobility is restricted, and that makes groups a pain. This area has all the frustration of Blighttown, Sen's Funhouse, and Anor Londo, without the satisfaction when beating it, or the feeling of mastery that comes along when you learn all the little tricks. Yeah, you definitely summed this up really well, voter. Other difficult areas feel rewarding when you beat them, while Tomb of the Giants just feels like a massive pain in the ass from start to finish. It doesn't feel exciting or interesting, it just feels like a slog. There's nothing to master when you can't see shit. That being said, I will defend the wormy sunlight maggot helmet. I do think the light it gives off is more than enough to survive the Tomb of the Giants. It's just a pain that it is hidden in a very weird subpath of a very annoying area in Lost Izalith. F-U-C-K Tomb of the Giants. I actually don't think I've ever wanted to not play a game as much as when I was stuck for weeks in this godforsaken area, and I know I'm far from the only one. Obviously, the main difficulty about it is how dark everything is, and when paired up with the tight level design along with these super strong enemies splattered all over the area, it doesn't make for an enjoyable experience at all. The fact is that everything difficult about Tomb of the Giants is also what makes it incredibly annoying. There's no way to advance properly without running into a giant skeleton dog or a precipice or a wall. Now you're confused on where you're supposed to be headed next. It's just a mess. As if this wasn't enough, there are slide platforms that are required to use if you want to advance. So if you accidentally take one, well, good luck finding your way back up. The worst part is I think that dark areas like this can work if done properly. The best example of this is Deep Nest from Hollow Knight. Deep Nest works solely because you actually can see a little of what's in front of you, even with how cramped and dangerous everything is. Your base instincts aren't completely altered because of your darkened FOV. Tomb of the Giants not only requires a light source if you want to make progress efficiently, which you can miss of course, it is filled to the brim with very strong enemies that just love to push you off the map any chance they get. It's also a very long area, and the second bonfire can easily be missed, so yeah. I actually really like that comparison to Hollow Knight there, but I do think there is a big difference between a darkened area in a 2D game versus a 3D game. The gimmick always works well in 2D because as a developer, you can more easily control what the player can see on screen at any given time. In 3D, you have to accommodate for the whole environment, including things behind the camera that you can't see, and I don't know, I just don't think games that do the let's make a dark area in 3D have really nailed it. It's a gimmick that doesn't feel very fun, and it's annoying because the potential is there. It was just so early on for FromSoft that I don't think they could reach said potential. A modern day dark area that you slowly light up, similar to the gutter from Dark Souls 2, now we'd be talking. Tomb of the Giants had me reconsidering going for the Dark Souls Platinum. The fact that this area is completely dark and filled with giant skeletons as well as small narrow pathways with death drops made it so hard and annoying as hell for me. I feel like most players would say Lost Izalith is annoying simply for the Bed of Chaos fight and its run back, but Tomb of the Giants had me suffer the most deaths out of any area, and I've dreaded it on any subsequent playthrough. The fact that Tomb of the Giants is what potentially stopped your platinum run, and not any of the genuinely awful collect all these rare weapons and farm these Covenant items trophies is truly iconic, I must say. That's the main reason I wanted to highlight this comment as someone who has done the platinum run for Dark Souls. Bro, Tomb of the Giants sucks. There's not a single positive comment on this area, and you know what? I'm okay with that. Tomb of the Giants is awful. It's one of the worst areas in the series, and I firmly believe it's not only the hardest area in Dark Souls, but it's the area that is most against the player in the way it's developed. A rather fitting conclusion for today's ranking. And that's my list. Did you agree with my community? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my future videos. If you want to take part in the Demon's Souls ranking, there is a link to the Google form down below where I promise every single area is in that form. So let your voices be heard, because the more votes we have, the more interesting the results will be. I want to give a shout out to my YouTube channel members for supporting me for another month. You guys are amazing, thank you so much. It's $4.99, you get early access to some future videos, you get a shout out in the description and at the end of videos as well, and you get access to special secret Let's Plays. So thanks for watching guys, I'll see you next time, adios.